At first glance, our first reading from the book of Deuteronomy and today's gospel seem to be a little bit at odds with one another. The book of Deuteronomy talks about the gift of God's law, the gift that God's law is to God's people. And Jesus seems to be pushing back on that just a little bit in today's gospel. But it's important to notice that what Jesus is pushing back against in the gospel is not the law itself, but how God's people might be misusing God's gift. He seeks to remind the people of Israel that the law is not the end of all things. God's law is a gift from God to us to allow us to facilitate our encounter with Him. He's the end. He's the goal. The goal of our life, the goal of our faith, isn't to be the best law follower. The goal of our faith is to be in love with Jesus and to love Him with all our mind and all our heart and all our soul. And God gives us His law to facilitate our encounter with that end, to facilitate our ability to love God and to receive His love in our life. But the temptation is for us as human beings then and even today to use the external framework and structure of God's law and forget about God. To think to ourselves that as long as I check all the right boxes and do all the right things and seem to conform to what the law says, then I will be okay. I will be good. I will be a devout person. But if we do those things, even if we are the perfect rule follower, if we don't let God's law move us and push us into deeper relationship with Jesus Christ, it's merely a shell. It can only get us so far. But my friends, that's the tricky part. Relationship with Jesus, it's hard to measure. It's hard to understand how well we're doing. There's no rubric. There's no framework. There's no syllabus or report card that says, here are your targets, and you've met them, you get an A, and if you don't meet them, you get an A- or a B+. God forbid on this campus. We like knowing where we are. We like knowing how we measure up and stack up against everyone else. We like knowing we have the A. And in that endeavor, being a good rule follower is much easier. I've done this, I do this, I go to Mass each day, I pray the rosary, I spend 30 minutes in adoration, I do all the things that the law of God, that the law of the church tells me to do. I must be good. I'm getting myself my A. That A will get me into heaven. And perhaps more dangerously, when our focus is so much on the rubric and the metric, we can use those things as a way of deciding how well we stack up against everyone else. And it can very easily lead us into judgment, into making false assumptions and presumptions about people, and into uncharity. Look how good I am doing compared to them. We're much easier to point out the faults of others than to be honest about the faults of our own. Much easier for us to focus on how everyone else has to grow than to be honest about how God is inviting us to grow. And so, the Lord reminds us today that yes, His law is a gift. Yes, His commands are true and just. And yes, those things can help us grow closer towards Him. But He has to be the object. He has to be the sole focus, the sole desire of our life. And we can't use God's law as an excuse to ignore our relationship with Him. Or even worse, put a stumbling block in our relationship with Him through judgment, through uncharity, through assumption. Cleanliness, holiness, it comes from within, not from without. It's not about finding the magical formula of things to do. It's not about finding the right list of pious practices and devotions to make us a holier person. It's about knowing that God is indeed God. It's about letting Him love us, and to let His love for us shape and form us after His own image. It's about letting God's mercy, God's compassion, God's love transform our hearts so that we become images of Him. And so as we gather for Eucharist this morning, as we gather in a very real and true way to welcome the Lord into our very selves, into our own bodies through the Holy Eucharist, let that gift sanctify us and nourish us to begin our transformation from within. Let us let this encounter plant God's word and life in us so that everything we do, everything we say, and everything we are may be a reflection of Him. And if that's the goal, if we let this encounter and every encounter with Him in prayer, with the scriptures and works of service and charity, if we let them nourish us and sustain us and shape the core of who we are, He will indeed sanctify us. And we will need not worry about what comes from without, because the strength of what is in us will protect us always and guide us home towards heaven.